Thank you for joining me. My name is Elaine Wilson, and my program today is featuring Michelangelo, the great sculptor, painter, architect, and poet, and one of his amazing sculptures called the Pietà. I'll be giving you some background on Michelangelo, and I also will include some information about Mary, the mother of Jesus, at the very end. But I also want to mention to you this book that I have written, and it includes information about what I'm going to talk about today, but then there are other layers as well. And after this program this week, I will be taking a short break, and when I come back, I'll be continuing with Michelangelo because I want to talk to you about some of his other really great works. I personally consider him to be the finest sculptor that the world has ever known. And I also want to make sure that the information that I share with you then is available for you in advance if you would like. Two ways. You can pick up a handout from me by getting in touch with Willow Valley, or in this book there also is additional information. As you have learned, what I talked to you about, what's on the handout, and then also what's in your bulletin are not always the same thing. The book is easy to find because it's on Amazon.com, and then you click on books, and then you click on Elaine Wilson and Messengers of Miracles, which is right there in your bulletin, and it will be on the screen. And the book is there in your lap within days. Let's get started with taking a look at this amazing man and this incredible work that he did, and I would happy to be featuring it for you at this particular season of the year. So let's go to Messengers of Miracles. Michelangelo Buonarroti, we call him Michelangelo. Would that if your name was Carolyn Smith, that you would be known as Carolyn and everybody would know exactly who you were. There are other people, men, who have been named Michelangelo, but he is Michelangelo. We'll take a good look at the Pietà today, and at the end I'll wrap up with several short points about the Virgin Mary. This is Michelangelo and a sketch that was done of him, and you can see that he lived a considerably long length of time in this period in history. He was born in a town called Caprese. It's interesting, today they call it Caprese Michelangelo because it's a better marketing tool for them. He was the second of 5 brothers, and he was born in this house. In my series that I'll be continuing with after the holidays, you'll see this picture again, and I'll go into more detail about the home that he lived in and about his life then. The city, Florence, was only 66 miles from Caprese. It still is only 66 miles from Caprese. And so it was the closest big city, and it became his city. It also was a place where his family moved off and on, so that it was kind of his second home, or maybe his double home. I mentioned at the onset that he was a sculptor, an architect, an artist, and a poet, and none of these are second-class areas of his involvement. He was an incredible artist. I will not be able to cover much about his architecture today, and in the following weeks I'll be talking specifically about his sculpture, and if there's time, perhaps something about his poetry, because it also is fabulous. Look at one thing that he wrote. The greater danger for most of us lies not in setting our aims too high and falling short, but rather in setting our goals too low and achieving their mark. How often that is the case. When I mention the name Michelangelo, many of you probably immediately go to this particular picture because it's the Sistine ceiling, and I'm sure that many of you, just like I, have been there, and perhaps more than once. In the very center of the ceiling is this particular panel, and it includes the finger of God giving life to the finger of Adam. The word Adam means man, and there is where it is on the ceiling. In the spring, perhaps I'll come back with a program that will discuss for you all of the thinking that Michelangelo put into that center panel that starts right here above the altar with the separation of light and darkness and ends up with the drunkenness of Noah. Also, the figures around the sides and the families that are here and the specific stories and why he picked him that are in the corners of the ceiling. So much to learn about any work that this man does. This piece by itself, and there's no time today to go into it, includes many figures. And these figures are also quite significant, and quite significant that all of them surround the image of God as he imagined him to look, and Adam is by himself. Closer to some of us is our understanding or appreciation of St. Peter's Basilica. It is more than a cathedral. A basilica is a place where the Pope is, and it is a higher level than a church or a cathedral. So it's called St. Peter's Basilica, and in the latter years of Michelangelo's life, he was the one who was asked by the Pope to design the dome for St. Peter's. Michelangelo died in 1564. And this was not completed until 1590. And they were able to complete it according to his specifications because every day he walked to the dome, climbed up on the scaffolding, and observed what the workmen were doing to make sure that it was exactly as he had hoped it would be. But they became nervous because he was getting older, and it was getting more difficult for him to get around. And so they asked him if he would make a large wooden model that they could then work from in case there were days when it might be inclement outside or he didn't feel up to it, that he would be confident that they would be doing what he asked. Inside St. Peter's Basilica, there still is that wooden replica. But you don't have to travel clear to Rome to see his dome. All you need to do is go to the capital of Pennsylvania, to Harrisburg. The dome on our capital is the only dome of all 50 states that is an exact replica, smaller than this one, but an exact replica of the dome on St. Peter's Basilica. Madonna of the Stairs is a piece that I will briefly discuss with you today, and then in the next program I will go into more detail about it because there's certainly some stories that go into his work with this and his years there. I say here that he studied with a well-known Florentine sculptor for about 1 year. His father, of course, who had been a notary, wanted him to be a businessman like himself and realized that it was not going to work. And Michelangelo definitely had a very strong personal perspective on what he wanted his life to be about. So he helped him secure a position in Florence with a sculptor. And after a year, Lorenzo de' Medici, the de' Medicis were ruling Florence at the time, Lorenzo de' Medici realized that this young man working for that sculptor was really very, very talented. But he needed an education, and he needed to be someplace a little bit more secure, so he invited him to live in his home. He attended classes with other de' Medici, with the de' Medici children. In fact, 2 of them go on to be popes in later years. And he also, Lorenzo de' Medici, had his own private sculpture garden, which was a working garden, so that selected young men, not casts of thousands, but selected young men could come there and work. Michelangelo completed this piece when he was 17 years old, and this is one of his early pieces. And he completed that in 1491. I make mention of only one aspect of this, and I will, as I said, revisit it the first Tuesday in January when I come back again. But you notice that beyond the figure of the Madonna with her child, there are 4 other figures back in here, and they are all busy doing things. Michelangelo's works never cease to amaze. They themselves are miracles in marble, but they also carry many messages with them. I want to talk to you about a hoax that made him famous. This is a sketch done by somebody of a sleeping Cupid, very much like one that he did. And let me show you another example of this, and then I'll be telling you a story. I have stories about the de' Medici family garden, and I'll discuss those the next time. But for this particular lesson today, I will not be spending much time on the Pietà again, so this story is important. The original Cupid is not this one, but it is carved very similar to the one that Michelangelo did do. And this Cupid, somehow or rather, found its way after his death to London. It was in a big home, and during the 1600s, the home caught fire, and the Cupid, along with most of the contents of the house, were consumed by the fire. Now, the story about this piece is interesting because Michelangelo had gone to Rome to study the unearthing of the famous Roman and Greek sculptures, because he knew that that was a source, a very ripe source of information for him about how he should paint or how he should sculpt. While he's there, and he's walking around the sites, he's finding little pieces of marble here and there and things going on. So he picked up a chunk of marble, and he took it back to where he was staying, and he carved a Cupid. Now, when he carved his sleeping Cupid, he kind of left it dirty so that it looked like it had just come out of the ground. In Rome at that time, there was a very important antique dealer, and this man prided himself on knowing immediately if a piece was authentic or not, because forgeries were floating around. They always do. Michelangelo walked into the man's shop, showed him his sleeping Cupid, and the man was just ecstatic. He couldn't believe it. It was an original. He'd never seen anything like it, and he was more than happy to give Michelangelo money. And of course, Michelangelo had accomplished 2 things with his sculpting efforts of the sleeping Cupid. First of all, he had fooled the famous antique dealer, but he also now had some extra money to live on. After he left the shop, he was satisfied with himself for a while, and then he started having second feelings about it. And he realized that in time, it would be considered an authentic piece, and it wasn't, and he knew that. So he pulled himself together, and he went back to the shop, and he walked into the man, and he said, "I'd like to have the sleeping Cupid back, and here's your money." And the man said, "Well, I can't give it to you." And so then a conversation ensued, and during that time, Michelangelo was enlightened. A Frenchman who was with the Holy Seed and already had a place in Rome. He was a cardinal. He had come into the shop just to look around, see if there was anything there he could afford to buy, and he saw the Cupid, and he bought it. And he was thrilled to death because he also considered himself to be quite an authority on ancient sculpture. And Michelangelo said, "Look, you have to get it back from him. I did it." Oh, the antique dealer was furious. Michelangelo said, here is the money. The antique dealer said, he said, I don't want them, just get out of here, just get out of here. Well, he said, Michelangelo said, well, you have to tell the cardinal. Take the money and give it to the cardinal. You have to give him his money back. So the antique dealer got in touch with the cardinal. The cardinal came in, and the cardinal said that he was initially furious that he had been duped. And then he thought, no, wait a minute. I have a spot inside St. Peter's Basilica where my tomb is going to be located. I need somebody to sculpt something for on top of my tomb. So he said to the antique dealer, what's this man's name? I want to visit him. So Michelangelo and the two met. And the end result is this amazing piece of work right here. This is one of Michelangelo's earliest pieces. He did it between 1498 and 1499 over a period of 2 years. He was approximately 21, 22 years old when this piece was done. And this piece is considered by everyone who knows anything about sculpture to be the most famous piece and the finest religious sculpture that has ever been created. This is the topic of today's conversation. The word Pietà means Virgin Mary mourning the death of Christ. And here you see the Virgin Mary with the body of Christ, which has been lifted from the cross and is laying across her lap. There are so many levels to understand about this piece. First of all, Michelangelo knew that the finest sculpture in Italy was and still is today. The whitest, purest marble is found in Carrara. So he went there and he got them to chip out for him a seamless piece of 6x6 marble, 6x6. And he had that shipped to Rome to a place where he could sculpt his Pietà. Of all of the works that Michelangelo will do during the rest of his life, this first piece is the piece that is considered to be the most highly finished of all of its works. It is polished beyond polish. It is absolutely an incredible piece to study or to be around, and is considered to be the masterpiece of all times ever done in marble. And I point out one thing to you here, and I'll come back to it again. When he did this arm for Mary, the arm is attached to the rest of the block here, but it swings free out here. That had never and has not ever since ever been done. If you have a small piece of marble, it's very heavy. Imagine the weight, let alone the carving into the marble to create that amazing arm and hand. Mary's garment disguises a lot. If Mary stood up, she'd be about 12 feet tall. She is much bigger than Christ. You don't notice that. Why? Because her hands and her face are in proportion to her son. And her shoulders might be a little broader, but then the robe flows down and covers the rest of her so that you are not aware of the change, the very big change in the size of the two figures. It was a masterful piece of work that how he came up with that. One of Michelangelo's favorite motifs was to work with a triangular shape. He doesn't do it all the time, but here you can see that the robe puddles out and then comes to a point at the top of Mary's head. So your eyes flow up across the sculpture. in the direction that he would have wanted you to go. This is a close-up of Mary. And if you look at her head, you'll see that it does form the vertex of the pyramid. And I'm going to show you with some arrows what I'm talking about with the angles that he used. This is all intentional. Nothing with Michelangelo's work is an accident, none of it. The shoulders are angled. The head is tilted. She's not stiff. She's sitting, and she's looking down at her son. But it is not a stiff piece, and it is not that because he has done exactly as I have shown you with those arrows. She appears much younger than her son, and that really created, of course, it's like anybody else. You get something good going, and then a whole lot of people are jealous, angry, wish they had done it first, whatever. And other sculptors and people who thought they were authorities on different things decided that he had done the wrong thing, that the figure of Mary, she couldn't have been that young. Well, she wasn't that young. She was probably 46, 48 years old, maybe older than that. But Michelangelo said, she is perpetually beautiful. She was pure. She had been untouched, and she will stay pure. And those with pure hearts tend, women with pure hearts tend to look younger longer. And Mary will always look young. I'm going to show you two examples of close-ups of the lower part of this sculpture and point out some aspects of those to you. Her knees aren't on a level plane. One foot rests on a stone. You can see it here. And there's one knee, and there's the other, and there's the body of Christ cradled on her lap. So it was a logical position, but a very intentional design of Michelangelo's. Her position, all 12 feet of her, naturally accommodates the body of her son. Some people say that if you take your finger and put it through into one of the folds in her robe, that you can see the shadow of your finger through the marble. That is how finely this piece was carved. No part of this piece is without just complete awe. And it's just amazing. Look at the fingers. Jesus' arm comes down, and instead of just hanging, it hooks. It hooks into the drape of his mother's robe, which is another way that brings him and her together. And the arrow is pointing, nothing was left out. The nail is visible on his hand, the nail hole, the impression of that. Here's a larger piece again, and this time I've taken this point and I wanted to make a couple of comments about that. First of all, he did include the place where the spear went into the side. The Roman drove the spear into the side of Christ. He also did something else. He extended the veins in Christ's body. He is alive. He is asleep on his mother's lap. He has, yes, died physically on the cross, but he lives forever. Famous physicians, people who are familiar with the construction of the human body, have stood in awe since the day this piece was unveiled at the positioning of the veins and the arteries and the structure of the body that this man at age 21 or 22 was able to do. There is a whole story about how he was able to do all that, how he learned how to do all of that, but I'll save that for our next session. But I do want to show you this. You see that Mary's hand has a cloth underneath it? And at this hand, she's reaching out as though this is the will of God. I can't do anything about it. But she's not touching his body in any place. She physically is not touching him because he has gone to another realm and he is holy. But she is still his mother. There is no evidence of the torture that Christ went through as he carried the cross up to Golgotha, but the blood does flow through his body because he does promise with his death everlasting life. And here again, I point out to you this amazing hand, which is now just saying to God, this is, I knew this was going to happen, this is your will, but still very sad. This is a close-up of the two of them. And Mary, Michelangelo has given her, as I mentioned, perpetual youth. She looks calm, serene, and as Michelangelo would have wanted her, eternally lovely. And look at this example of the face of Christ. He's asleep. He will awaken into eternity. But he is alive even though men have killed his body. This piece is fascinating because when Michelangelo did it, he wasn't sure that people were really going to like it very much. And so what he did is, it was in St. Peter's. He went to where it was, and he stood back. And because we didn't have television, newspapers, and nobody knew what he looked like, and they had all gone to look at this piece of sculpture. Different groups would come in, and individuals, and he was standing to one side the first evening that he was there, and he heard two men talking. So he stepped a little closer, and the one man said, who did this piece? This is just an amazing piece of work. And the other man said, well, I think it was the hunchback Solari. Solari is a good sculptor here in Rome, and I think it is his work. Well, Michelangelo knew Scolari, and Michelangelo really had his own opinion about the quality of work that Scolari had done. And interestingly enough, across the robe, the front of the robe of Mary, Michelangelo had sculpted this band, which was to secure her robe. But it was plain. And that night, Michelangelo snuck back to where the sculpture was, and he chiseled into the sculpture, Michael Buonarroti had made this. And then he walked away. He will end up for the rest of his life feeling badly that he did that. He didn't think he should have. At that time in history, if somebody paid, like it was the French cardinal, had paid to have a piece done, the piece belonged to them. And the sculptor was a craftsman, but his name would not have gone on the piece of work. Michelangelo regretted for the rest of his life that in a fit of anger and disgust, he had done what he had done, but it was too late. So this is the only piece of his sculpture that Michelangelo ever signed. Today, if you walk into St. Peter's Basilica and you go in the right-hand side and you go about 2 bays, this is where the Virgin Mary, the Pietà, and Christ are located. It is, pardon me, it is behind bulletproof glass, and you can't get any closer than 15 feet to it, but it is still remarkable. And people say that in St. Peter's Basilica, and the building is the largest basilica, the largest church structure in the world, that the quietest place in that building is in front of this piece of sculpture, more so than over the tomb of St. Peter himself. This piece only left Rome one time, and that was for the New York's World Fair in 1964. There was an agreement that was made between the Pope and Cardinal Spellman that if the World's Fair was awarded to New York, that the Vatican would loan them the Pietà. So the Pope kept his word, and the piece of sculpture was shipped, and it did go to New York, and it did come back, but it was gone a total of 19 months. What went on there instead? Well, there were some people who had done copies of it, and so they picked a fairly decent copy so that the bay was not empty. However, once the piece safely returned to St. Peter's Basilica, the Pope vowed then that she would never leave home again. An entire 19 months, he was just a nervous wreck over it. Those of you who have been or did visit the World's Fair in New York in 1964, as I did, might be interested in a little bit of the background on how they got it from Rome to New York. First of all, it was packed. You can see she's being packed into a crate here. There are actually 3 crates. She's actually sitting, that Pietà is sitting on a concussion-proof flooring. So if for any reason that crate would get bumped, it would not jar that sculpture at all. And all around that interior one were the very, very, very finest of packing styrofoam beads. And then another shell was put around it, and then another one on top of that. And it was designed so that if something happened to the ship, the box would float, the crate that held the Pietà. This is St. Peter's in the background, and this is the morning that they left to go to the Naples, where the ship was docked to take the Pietà to New York. The ride to Naples is 133 miles, and I can tell you that it went very, very slowly because it was very important that nothing happened to this piece of work. And you can see, if you've been to St. Peter's, there are usually crowds of people around. There were not. This was early morning when this was done. They had second thoughts about loading the Pietà on a floating ship, so they put the ship in dry dock. And then, from that position, hoisted the Pietà into position, not down below. It was strapped securely to the deck. Why? Something could happen to the ship. There were release belts on this. If something happened to the ship, this would float. This box was painted orange on the top, and there were small lights and warnings and signals that were embedded in this, so that from 50 feet above the water, this could be discovered and this could be retrieved. You'll also notice standing to either side of this, there were guards. That was 24/7 duty until this reached New York City. When it got to the dock in New York City, New York had already done a dry run on all of this ahead of time to see if it could work. And so when the real one comes, they have already decided that the quietest time for the streets of New York City was maybe around 2 o'clock in the morning. So the ship waited until the right time, and then the Pietà was unloaded and trucked safely to the site where it's at for the World's Fair. If you were there, maybe in your mind you go back again. There it is. This picture doesn't show the votive candles that were around it. I went there, and being me, I not only went through with 27 million other people, But after I finished the ride on the conveyor belt that took me past it, I quickly ran around the building, got in line, and went through again. I didn't know that I would have the opportunity, and the years that were to follow, to see the Pietà on site in Rome a number of times. But it was important to be there then. And in here, it was quiet, just like it still is today in St. Peter's Basilica. This is not a pretty scene, is it? Look what's going on there. This was Pentecost Sunday in May of 1972. We've gotten the Pietà to and from the World's Fair in New York City, and everything is fine. And then on Pentecost Sunday in 1972, we have this going on. This man is using a huge sledgehammer, and he is battering away at the figure of Mary. He had walked into the basilica that morning, and it was a rainy morning, so it made sense that he had a raincoat over his arm, and under his raincoat he was carrying the sledgehammer. There were a number of people collected early that morning, and they were standing quietly in front of, in awe or in prayer, in front of the Pietà. He moved forward into the crowd and then right up onto the platform that it was at that point sitting on. There was no protective glass there as there is now. And he started to bash away at the Pietà with the sledgehammer. And the whole time he is yelling, "I am Christ, this is my birthday, I am 33, I am Jesus Christ, the Mother of God does not exist." He never touched the figure of Christ, but he did severe damage to Mary. One of the men that is standing there in the audience, they were all in shock when this started to happen. One of them eventually was awarded a very special cross from the Holy Catholic Church because he was the first one to come to his senses, jump up, and go after this man. And here you can see this newspaper picture of them bringing him back down. His name was Laszlo Toth. He was Hungarian by birth, but he had an Australian passport. And he was able, during the course of time, till the man grabbed him, he hit the Virgin Mary 15 times with the sledgehammer. Now he is really hitting her as hard as he can. So again, I make comment back to how much work it took for Michelangelo to carve this figure, how much strength it took for him to do that. And in 15 blows, this man does some dangerous work. What happens to him after they catch him? They don't put him in jail, they send him to an institution for insane people, and he's there for 2 years. And then the country of Italy said, "We're done trying to take care of him. He is persona non grata," and they shipped him back to Australia with his passport. The Australians also did not think much of him, and so they also put him into an institution, and within the last 15, 20 years or so, he died. He never once mentioned having done any of this. But look, that's how she did look. This is how she looked after he was done using the sledgehammer on her. Eye, part of her nose is missing, chips in the covering on her head. People that were there, one woman fainted. It was absolutely mayhem. It was a terrible scene when this man did this. And the Pope was called immediately. He got flowers, he came down, and he offered a prayer, and of course everybody was ushered out. A couple people reached down and grabbed small pieces of marble to take with them as kind of a souvenir for this. And as time went on and the restoration for the Pietà began, they had second thoughts about having that marble, and they returned it. So the workmen were able to collect, one way or the other, every piece of marble that they could find that was on the floor or that was returned to them that they could use to reconstruct the damage that was done by Lazio Toth. The Pietà, until they could move it to a secure site, was draped in black. And that must have been just disheartening to have come into a scene. But look at this. That's what damage he did to her hand. Now they still had to find the other parts, the other fingers. But you see, when they found this larger piece, they were able to, what they had to do is they had to bore into that piece to then secure the pieces that they had found to reconstruct what Michelangelo had done, not effortlessly, but had done with such glory. There she is, damaged. Her head was attacked the most, and then, of course, he whacked off her forearm and her hand coming out here. But no damage was done to Jesus because he thought on his 33rd birthday that he was Jesus. There it is. And there it is today. Now notice this. Do you see the small line? They couldn't get rid of that. So from the distance that you would see her in St. Peter's Basilica, and I have since this in 72, this isn't obvious, but the lighting is such here that you can see the line where the nose was damaged. There's only one place on this piece of sculpture that was not repaired, and it's way back on the back of her head. And the only reason that they left that very small chunk the way it was that with history, stories keep changing and people keep trying to tell things, make things up. This didn't happen, that didn't happen. This happened. This really did happen. In the back of her head is the evidence. But there is her nose. There's before, and there is after. Now, I also want to talk today about a couple other Pietas that Michelangelo did. One of them is called the Deposition. And this is a very interesting piece, and there's a small story about this that I'd like to share with you. When Michelangelo was 77, he was working on other projects, and a lot of them had to do with architecture. And he wanted to keep his sculpting skills sharp. So he had begun this piece that perhaps would have been placed on his tomb. It didn't make it, but it might have been there. And he had gotten a very large block of Carrara marble, and he had started to work on it. It shows the crucified Christ. You can see that. This figure is Mary Magdalene because she was at the cross. This figure on the other side is his mother, the Virgin Mary. But there's a man in the piece. And the man in the piece is either Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus, because both of those men were there to help lift down the body of Christ from the cross after he died. This piece is missing its entire left leg. You see that? It's gone. Why? Michelangelo found, after doing all of this work, that there was a flaw in the marble. He had a very bad temper and a very little patience with things that went wrong. And he used a sledgehammer on this piece, and he just started to destroy it. Now, why do we still have it? Well, let me go on with another slide and tell you the rest of the story. You'll notice that these three faces are all done in one way, and then this one is refined. When he damaged this piece, he decided that he didn't really want it anymore, and one of the men that was working in his studio, and they came in and cleaned up after him and helped with things whenever they could, but they really didn't sculpt on his work. He just gave it to him. And so then that man sold it to somebody else who got in touch with a sculptor who then decided that they would fix this. So the first thing they did was to start to work on repairing what damage they could. He had taken off this arm and part of this body, but they put it back together, and then they started to sculpt what they considered to be Mary Magdalene. But there's no pain, there's no expression really at all. This is not Michelangelo's work. His concept, but that's not his work. This is much more the work of Michelangelo. So they got him stopped, but before they did, he had done quite a bit of what historians now consider to be damage. He had carved into the hand and part of the leg and the drape on the figure. Michelangelo, you can see the vein here and this line through here. Michelangelo had broken that off. And as I said earlier, he's missing his whole left leg, and most people will look at this and never even realize that Jesus really only has one leg there. And then, of course, the story is that Michelangelo is the one that destroyed it. The only figure in this piece that Michelangelo did not disturb when he was slinging the sledgehammer at it was this figure up here. That's his self-portrait. This is probably Michelangelo's last impression of himself. He did not touch this figure, only this area down here. I want to show you this piece because this piece, I'm going to show you this from several different angles because it's an interesting piece. The stories go back and forth as to whether it's Michelangelo's or not. Let me say this first. It was Michelangelo's original block of marble, and it was Michelangelo's original idea. But he evidently got distracted. He did not damage this piece, but he evidently got distracted from 1555 until the year that he died. He was distracted with other things and he didn't get back to it. So it ended up being in his studio and somebody else started to work on it. Now let me point out a couple of things that kind of substantiate what I just said. There's no triangle there, folks. That's a square. That's a rectangle. You can see the back of the block here. Michelangelo always started to carve from the very front of the block and then move back. But this particular piece is not the same as it would have been had Michelangelo actually worked on it alone. Look at here, the side of the block there. And also notice something else about this piece that are things about this that are clues as to why somebody else worked on it. It's still a valuable piece. I've seen it. It's in the same building where the David is that he did that I'll be discussing with you next time. This piece is a wonderful piece, but look at this. The heads are way too large, both of them. This one is perhaps more in scale, but the heads are large. Look at something else. Look at the size of that arm. Look at that. And then look at the skinny thigh. Michelangelo would never have let anything like that go. Look at this. Look at it over here. So it's an important piece that he worked on, and he does about 4 Pietas during his lifetime. But one that he definitely did is this one. And he worked on this until about 6 days before he died. This was supposed to be the piece that would be on top of his tomb. It was originally a very large block of marble. Now, why do I say that? because there are clues as to what happened with this piece as he was working on it. And look, he worked on this for a number of years. He was working on St. Peter's Basilica dome at the same time. These are different angles of this piece. And you go, what is that? That, folks, is the original arm of Jesus. Mary is standing on a block behind him. But Jesus was a larger figure, and Mary's head was turned. I could not find a good picture to show you her other eye. Her head was originally turned. This was an adaptation that he made because, again, he found a flaw. He didn't do what he had done to the earlier piece, but he did start to chisel away at it to get back to the flawless Carrara marble that he preferred. Notice something else. The head of Jesus in this piece looks fine, but if you look, the head is also the shoulder of Mary. And in this piece, you have a contrast between the first one that I spent time with you on and this one, which shows you the mother and child not as separate entities. And here, Mary is touching her son. This is the union of the son and the mother at the end, and how appropriate that it would be the last piece that Michelangelo would have worked on. So now we have two bookends. You have the first Pietà and you have the final one. You have two Christ figures. Here you see both of them really refined and delicate and beautiful and peaceful. And over here, it's rough, it's unfinished. There's a consumption of sorrow here with this piece. He didn't have time to finish it, or it might have been more refined. But at this point in his life, he was not necessarily finishing pieces. And as I said earlier, I will get to that story later, or if you're interested, it's included in the book that I wrote called Messengers of Miracles. He did this one at 23, and he did this one until he died, 6 days before he died, and he was 89. So it's really an example of his life coming full circle. I do want to make a couple of points about Mary, because many of us are Protestant, some are Jewish, some are Catholic, some are not believers, but nevertheless there are stories that are truthful about the Virgin Mary. She was a Jewish teenager, and she was betrothed to an older man, and she does give birth to the Savior of mankind, and she is not married to him at the time that the announcement came that she would carry the Son of God. So her emotional stress had to have been extreme. She was shunned by her society, but she knew she served a greater purpose, and so she trusted and obeyed. Her life also made a complete circle, the joy of her first child, and then watching the sorrow of him suffering and die on the cross. There is no question. She is a star in heaven's crown. And she gave over her life to the service of God at the highest order. Michelangelo also dedicated his life primarily to religious subjects because he was a very faith-filled man. If you're walking from Trevi Fountain in Rome to the Forum, you would pass this building and perhaps not even notice the sign on the front. This is the last home that Michelangelo lived in. Michelangelo never owned his own home because he always worked for somebody who provided him with studio space and lodging. Mary, at the end of the life of Christ, Jesus looks down at Mary, and his apostle John is standing there at the altar, or at the cross with her, and he said to John, "Take care of my mother. And Mary, this is now your son." John's last years were spent in Ephesus, and that's where his tomb is. That's where he lived out the last days of his life. So it's understandable that Mary's last home might have been this one. It does sit, I visited this, it does sit on a foundation that is dated back to the year 100. So something has stood on this site for a long, long time. So this could have been her last earthly home. I don't say it was, it could have been. This was Michelangelo's last earthly home. When Michelangelo sensed that his life was slipping from him, he started to burn his sketches and his plans for his work. He didn't want people to know how much effort it had taken for him to create what he did. Fortunately, over time, people have been able to scurry together about 900 sketches. One of them in the last 10 years was found in a book in the Vatican. It had been a sketch that he had done for a workman to give him an idea as to what to do next with the dome construction. And then the workman had studied the sketch, and then he had needed to make some notes for himself about something. And so he just wrote over top of the sketches and stuck it in a book and forgot about it. And it was there for a long, long time. Anything that is found that has to do with anything Michelangelo has touched is certainly considered precious. There's the Pietà. One last look at her with the band across her chest. And one last comment from the sculptor, architect, painter, and poet Michelangelo. The greater good for us lies not in setting our aims too high and falling short, but rather in setting our goals too low and achieving our mark. We must never be afraid to step forward. Here they are. Michelangelo, gifted beyond gifts, and Mary, blessed beyond all. See why I call them messengers of miracles? Because they were. And they also understood that the high marks that were set for them were important. And so they simply said, yes, we could do as well. Both were unlikely choices for the roles that God chose for them. She was a lowly little 13-year-old teenager. He was a man from Caprese, a little town outside of Florence, Italy. But it doesn't matter. There are no limits. Any one of us is a candidate for glories. Martin Luther King once said that being famous is not important. Being great is important. And great works rest in all of us. Great works does not mean that everybody knows you. It means that somebody does. Great works might mean just baking cookies. It might be taking care of somebody. It might be giving smiles to people. It can be many different things, but the potential is there for us. If you have any questions or comments about today's program, please don't hesitate to be in touch. Otherwise, you can always email them to askpresenter@willowvalley.org or directly to me, which some of you do. January the 5th is when I will be back with another program that features Michelangelo. And there will be 2 in this series. There is one handout for both series. And if you're interested in that, it's available now. And you can get that from the website, the Willow Valley Ask Presenter website. Now, I have a couple of other comments that I would like to make, and one of them is, again, to remind you that this book is available. I don't need to sell books, but I do want to make sure that when I have information that I have carefully researched and that I can offer to you as truth, that it is made available to you. So that's what this is. And this book includes some of his paintings, it includes some of his sculpture, it includes other pieces that he has done, and in more depth close-up studies of the work that I just showed you today. I really hope that the holidays will be good for all of us. It has been a tough year. Some of us have lost close friends or family. Some of us have been very frightened for ourselves or for others. But it is still a good world. It's the only one we have. Take care of yourself. Enjoy the holidays. Enjoy the holidays. If you can breathe, if you are alive, you have something to be grateful for. Take care. See you next year. Bye-bye.